September 24th, 1960, the James River, Virginia. The world watched as a monstrosity of steel slid into the water. It was the longest naval vessel ever built, 1,123 feet from bow to stern. But the real revolution was hidden deep inside the armored hull. Unlike every warship before it, this Predator did not burn oil. It was driven by 8 A2W nuclear reactors, a 450,000 horsepower beast that could circle the globe 20 times without stopping. This is the story of the USS Enterprise, the ship that was so fast it left its own escort fleet behind. To understand why the Enterprise was built, we must first look at the Achilles heel of the U.S. Navy in the 1950s. Oil. A conventional carrier like the Forrestal class was a formidable weapon, but it was also a thirsty one. Every few days, it had to slow down, drop its guard, and connect hoses to a vulnerable tanker. In a potential war with the Soviet Union, these tankers would be the first targets. Admiral Hyman G. Rickover, the father of the nuclear navy, proposed a radical solution. A carrier that never needed to stop. A floating airbase that could sprint from Norfolk to the Mediterranean at top speed, arrive fully charged, and launch airstrikes immediately. The strategic advantage was obvious. The engineering required to build it, however, was borderline impossible. The challenge was power density. In the late 1950s, the Navy did not have a single massive reactor capable of driving a 90,000-ton ship. They only had smaller reactors designed for submarines. So, the engineers made a brute force decision. If one reactor is not enough, use 8. This decision created the most complex propulsion system ever conceived. The CVN-65 was fitted with 8 Westinghouse A2W pressurized water reactors. They drove 32 heat exchangers. The plumbing alone was a nightmare. Miles of high-pressure piping weaving through the bowels of the ship. It was redundant, heavy, and incredibly expensive. But it produced a staggering 280,000 shaft horsepower on the official record. In reality, it was much, much higher. October 1961, sea trials. The Enterprise headed into the Atlantic to stretch its legs. The crew opened the throttles. The acceleration was violent. A ship the size of the Chrysler Building began to carve through the ocean like a speedboat. When the helm ordered a hard turn at full power, the ship leaned so aggressively that furniture slid across the decks. The Enterprise clocked speeds exceeding 35 knots. Some reports suggest it touched 40. It was so fast that the destroyers assigned to protect it could not keep up in rough seas. For the first time in history, the capital ship was the fastest vessel in the fleet. The Big E was ready for war. October 1962. The world stood on the razor's edge of nuclear annihilation. The Big E had been in commission for less than a year when President Kennedy issued the quarantine order. Soviet ships were steaming toward Cuba, carrying ballistic missiles capable of striking Washington, D.C. The Enterprise was ordered to the blockade line. This was the moment the 8-reactor design justified its billion-dollar price tag. While conventional carriers in the fleet had to carefully manage their fuel reserves to ensure they could fight upon arrival, the Enterprise simply sprinted. She cut through the Atlantic at full military power, arriving on station days ahead of schedule. On the blockade line, the atmosphere was suffocating. American P-2 Neptune aircraft and destroyers were hunting Soviet submarines. The Enterprise served as the command hub, her radars sweeping the horizon for the Soviet freighters. For the first time, the Soviet Navy was staring down a warship that did not need to retreat. It was a psychological weapon as much as a tactical one. The Enterprise remained on station, fully powered and ready to launch nuclear-armed Skyhawks at a moment's notice, until the Soviets finally blinked. With the Cuban crisis averted, the Navy decided to flaunt its new power. In 1964, the admirals devised a mission that would have been logistically impossible just a decade prior. It was called Operation Sea Orbit. The goal was simple but arrogant: to circumnavigate the globe without a single fuel stop. The formation was known as Task Force 1. It consisted of the Enterprise, the cruiser USS Long Beach, and the frigate USS Bainbridge. All three were nuclear-powered. For 65 days, they steamed through the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, around the Cape of Good Hope, and across the Pacific. They covered 30,565 miles. Logisticians around the world were stunned. A conventional fleet would have required dozens of oilers and complex rendezvous schedules to complete this journey. Task Force 1 did it at an average speed of 22 knots, completely independent of shore bases. It was a clear message to the Kremlin. The United States Navy could now project power anywhere on Earth, and there was no supply line to cut. But the atom could not protect the ship from human error and volatile chemistry. On the morning of January 14, 1969, the Enterprise was conducting flight operations near Hawaii. A tractor unit carrying a starter unit backed up too close to a stack of Zuni rockets mounted on an F-4 Phantom. The hot exhaust from the starter unit cooked a rocket warhead. At 8:19 a.m., the rocket exploded. The blast ruptured the fuel tanks of the Phantom. Hundreds of gallons of JP-5 jet fuel poured onto the flight deck and ignited. It was an inferno. But the Zuni explosion was just the match. The fire quickly spread to a bomb rack loaded with Mark 82 500-pound bombs. 60 seconds later, the bombs began to cook off. 3 massive explosions rocked the 65,000-ton hull. The blasts were so powerful, they blew a hole through the flight deck, sending burning fuel and molten steel into the decks below. 27 sailors were killed. 314 were injured. It took hours of desperate, heroic damage control to save the ship. The steel giant survived, but the scars of 1969 would remain forever. After repairs, the Enterprise entered the 1970s as the Queen of the Fleet. This was the era of transition. The older Skyhawks and Phantoms were phased out, replaced by the ultimate fleet defender, the Grumman F-14 Tomcat. The pairing of the Enterprise and the Tomcat was legendary. The F-14 was a heavy, complex, swing-wing fighter that required powerful catapults. The Enterprise's nuclear steam supply system provided endless pressure to the steam catapults, allowing her to launch these 27-ton fighters rapidly, one after another, regardless of the wind conditions. However, the 8-reactor experiment was showing its age. While the ship was operationally superior, maintaining 8 separate nuclear plants was a logistical nightmare for the engineering department. Refueling the ship, replacing the uranium cores, took years and cost hundreds of millions of dollars. The Navy realized that while the Enterprise was effective, she was too complex. Future carriers, like the Nimitz class, would use just 2 more powerful reactors. The Enterprise was destined to remain the only one of her kind. By the 1990s, the Soviet Union had collapsed. The great naval battles the Enterprise was built for never happened. Instead of hunting submarines in the Atlantic, the Big E found a new purpose in the scorching heat of the Middle East. The mission shifted from sea control to power projection. During Operation Desert Fox and later in the Persian Gulf, the Enterprise became a floating siege engine. Her flight deck was a ceaseless factory of destruction. Launch, strike, recover, reload.
The nuclear reactors allowed the ship to generate massive amounts of fresh water and electricity, keeping the air conditioning running for the delicate avionics and the exhausted crew in temperatures exceeding 110 degrees. While conventional ships struggled with the logistics of sustainment in the Gulf, the Enterprise simply remained on station, delivering millions of pounds of precision-guided ordnance on targets in Iraq. September 11, 2001. The Enterprise was on her way home. She had just completed a long deployment in the Persian Gulf and was steaming south toward the Cape of Good Hope. The crew was looking forward to seeing their families in Norfolk. Then, the towers fell. Without waiting for direct orders from the National Command Authority, the captain made a decision that would go down in naval history. He ordered a 180-degree turn. The Enterprise throttled up to flank speed. She raced back toward the Arabian Sea. She was the first U.S. aircraft carrier to arrive on station off the coast of Afghanistan. The opening salvos of Operation Enduring Freedom, the strikes against Al-Qaeda training camps, were launched from her deck. The Big E had gone from a Cold War relic to the tip of the American spear in the War on Terror. But even a nuclear giant cannot defeat time. By 2012, the Enterprise was 51 years old. Her hull was tired. Her systems were obsolete. The Navy made the difficult decision to retire her. But this led to an engineering problem that no one had fully solved. How do you throw away a ship with 8 nuclear hearts? Complex and analytical. Decommissioning a Nimitz-class carrier with 2 reactors is hard. Decommissioning the Enterprise is a nightmare. The ship was towed to Newport News shipbuilding, where the defueling process began. It involved cutting through the thick, armored flight deck to extract the spent fuel rods from the 8 reactors. This process alone took years and cost hundreds of millions of dollars. But the fuel was just the beginning. The reactor vessels themselves irradiated steel structures buried deep within the ship remain a massive disposal challenge. Slow and factual. Today, the husk of the Enterprise sits in limbo. The Navy is still debating how to dismantle the nuclear package. To cut the reactors out individually is too dangerous and expensive. One proposal suggests cutting out the entire midsection of the ship, a huge chunk of steel containing all 8 containment vessels, and shipping it on a heavy lift barge to a disposal site in Washington State. It is a quiet, rusty end for a ship that once outran destroyers. The sheer cost of her disposal is the final proof of why the 8-reactor experiment was never repeated. It was a marvel of engineering performance, but a catastrophe of life cycle management. The Enterprise was built in an era where performance mattered more than price, and we are still paying the bill for that ambition today. Analytical and comparative. The Enterprise was a creature of the 1960s. It was built with slide rules and raw ambition. Today, Its spiritual successor is the Gerald R. Ford class. When you compare them, the difference is staggering. The Ford generates 3 times the electrical power of the Enterprise, yet it runs on just 2 A-1B reactors. Sharp contrast. Where the Enterprise relied on a labyrinth of high-pressure steam pipes to launch jets, the Ford uses electromagnetic rails. The complexity has been engineered out. The Enterprise needed a crew of over 5,000 sailors just to function. Modern carriers do more with less people. The Big E was the prototype that proved nuclear power worked, but it also proved that more reactors did not always equal a better ship. But you cannot kill the spirit of the Enterprise. The Navy has already ordered the next vessel to bear the name, CVN-80. It will be the 9th ship in American naval history to carry the name Enterprise. Construction is already underway. Steel from CVN-65, melted down and recycled, is being incorporated into the hull of the new ship. The radioactive heart of the old beast may be buried in a trench in Washington, but its soul will sail again. The new Enterprise is scheduled to commission in the late 2020s, carrying the legacy of the 8-reactor giant into the mid-21st century. Looking back, the USS Enterprise CVN-65 stands as a monument to a specific moment in human history. A time when we believed atomic power was the magic key to everything. We built nuclear merchant ships, we designed nuclear airplanes, and we built a ship with 8 hearts. We will never see a machine like this again. It was too expensive, too complex, and too dangerous to replicate. It was a beautiful, terrifying mistake that ruled the oceans for 51 years. It was the fastest, longest, and most aggressive carrier ever to sail. The ultimate expression of American naval supremacy. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the engineering madness of the Cold War, make sure to hit that subscribe button. We have more stories coming about the secret projects that the Navy tried to hide. Next week, we might just look at the Soviet submarine that was made of gold. You do not want to miss that. Dismissed.